Imagine a high-ranking diplomat arriving in Washington, D.C. They represent a thriving democracy and a major global economy, yet for decades they've been treated like a ghost. They aren't allowed to walk through the front door of the State Department. They can't host a simple flag-raising ceremony without triggering a diplomatic meltdown. In 2015, when they dared to raise their flag at a historic residence in D.C., the U.S. government didn't offer a salute. They issued a stern reprimand, essentially telling them, "Don't let this happen again." For nearly half a century, U.S. Taiwan relations have been governed by these unwritten rules, a delicate dance of shadows designed to avoid poking the bear in Beijing. But last week, a single signature from Donald Trump changed the music. With the Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act, those decades-old restrictions aren't just being questioned, they're being systematically dismantled. On the surface, it looks like a total victory for Taipei, a normalization of ties that transforms a vague friendship into a legally mandated, institutionalized partnership. To the supporters in Taipei, it feels like the long-awaited moment they finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light of federal recognition. However, if you look closer at the timing, the celebratory mood starts to feel a bit premature. Just as this law hits the books, a much bigger date is looming on the calendar, April. That's when Trump is scheduled to sit down face-to-face with Xi Jinping. Suddenly, this ironclad guarantee starts to look less like a permanent shield and more like a high-stakes bargaining chip. The law mandates a review of these guidelines every 5 years, but it doesn't say how they must be changed, only that the president has the power to do it. It leaves us with a chillingly pragmatic question. Is this act a genuine insurance policy for a Democratic ally, or is it simply a price tag hanging over the negotiating table in Beijing? Today, we're looking past the legal jargon to see who really holds the cards in this three-way game of diplomatic poker. Okay, let's unpack this. That's a really high-stakes shift. You frame this as moving from these shadow rules to a mandatory law.
It is.
So this Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act, which we'll call it HR 1159, what does it actually force the State Department to do right now? And why is this so fundamentally different from how things were done before?
Well, it's a seismic shift, really. For decades, the entire relationship was governed by these administrative restrictions.
Set by who?
By the diplomats themselves. They were internal rules designed to prevent high-level contact, to avoid anything that might, infuriate Beijing. Those were the shadow rules.
Diplomatic dance.
Exactly. And HR 1159, which amends the 2020 Taiwan Assurance Act, it just flips the entire script. It moves from managing sensitivities to systematically prioritizing support.
Okay, so what's the core mandate? What's the action item?
The action item is the removal of these historical restrictions. The goal is to facilitate seamless official communication and security cooperation between Washington and Taipei.
And how does it do that? Through what mechanism?
It does it by requiring the Secretary of State to submit, and this is the key part, periodic reviews and updated reports related to the existing Taiwan guidelines.
Periodic reviews. How often is that? Were we talking about like an annual check-in or something even more institutional?
This is where the mandatory nature really kicks in. The reviews and reports have to happen not less frequently than every 2 years.
Every 2 years? Wow.
Yeah, think about that. The U.S. government is now legally obligated on a biennial basis to audit its own behavior toward Taiwan.
So no more letting things slide.
No more. It can't just let the old customs atrophy. It has to actively question them and then change them.
That sounds like Congress is basically issuing a homework assignment to the State Department with a very, very clear objective.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the crucial directive, the prompt for that homework, is incredibly specific. The reports must include an identification of opportunities and plans to lift self-imposed restrictions on relations with Taiwan.
So they're not just asking what are the rules, they're asking how are you getting rid of them?
Exactly. They are demanding a concrete plan for dismantling the last vestiges of strategic ambiguity within the bureaucracy itself. It turns the whole process from this discretionary kind of don't ask, don't tell approach into a mandatory show us your work, show us how you are normalizing this relationship framework.
For people who haven't followed this closely, it might be difficult to really grasp just how petty and, frankly, frustrating those shadow rules were for Taipei. Can you elaborate a little more on the kind of friction they caused?
Oh, absolutely. The anecdote you shared in the introduction about the flag-raising ceremony in 2015 is a perfect example.
It seems so minor on the surface.
It was. This wasn't some rogue political action. It was a simple private cultural event at the Twin Oaks estate. That's the former residence of the Republic of China ambassador. It has historical significance.
And yet, raising their own flag there was a problem.
A huge problem. When the Taiwanese flag was briefly raised, the U.S. government, the Obama administration at the time, issued an official, stern reprimand. They were essentially punishing Taiwan for daring to act like a sovereign, normal diplomatic partner, and on American soil, no less.
What were some of the other restrictions?
Well, they were equally frustrating. Taiwanese officials were often banned from meeting their U.S. counterparts in official State Department buildings.
Seriously? So where would they meet?
Sometimes in coffee shops or outside venues. Can you imagine? There were also restrictions on official travel, on the types of uniforms that Taiwanese military personnel could wear in the U.S., and even on the titles used in official communications. It was 1,000 tiny cuts.
So this bill, H.R. 1159, is the legislative sledgehammer that's trying to smash down all those administrative walls.
Yeah.
But we did see a temporary attempt at this before, didn't we?
Yes, that's a great point. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, near the end of the Trump administration, he briefly declared all of these self-imposed guidelines null and void.
So he took his own sledgehammer to the rules.
He did. But the problem was, it was an administrative action. So the subsequent administration, being hesitant to lock in such a definitive shift, just declined to continue this policy. H.R. 1159 makes it a law. It ensures this issue cannot just be ignored or reversed by the next person in charge.
And the intent behind this law, it's not just about being friendlier to Taiwan, is it? There's a deeper strategic logic.
Oh, for sure. The legislative intent is rooted in this belief that the State Department's long-standing policy of, opacity and red tape was ultimately self-defeating.
So.
The argument is that by acting so cautiously, so timidly to avoid upsetting Beijing, the U.S. was actually creating a diplomatic vacuum, a window of opportunity that, as the bill supporters put it, invites bullies like Xi and Putin to push the envelope.
So weakness invites aggression.
That's the consensus, and it was an overwhelmingly bipartisan consensus on this measure. The feeling in Congress is that U.S. support for Taiwan must now be, quote, unmistakable.
And that unmistakable support is also showing up in other parallel legislative pushes. I want to look at two other bills that really show this institutional commitment, starting with the reintroduction of the Taiwan Relations Reinforcement Act in 2025. What's that one aiming to do?
This is a major, major diplomatic step. It directly targets the status of the top U.S. official in Taiwan.
Right now, that person heads the American Institute in Taiwan, the AIT.
Correct. This bill would elevate that position to a Senate-approved representative.
That sounds like a subtle change in title, but it's powerful, isn't it? Why does Senate approval matter so much here?
It matters immensely because Senate confirmation is reserved for ambassadorial or equivalent level positions. It means the head of AIT would gain the prestige, the rank, and the diplomatic weight usually reserved for our top officials in recognized countries.
So it's a de facto upgrade.
A dramatic one. And it also provides a new layer of congressional accountability. But there's more. The bill also establishes an interagency Taiwan task force.
A task force.
Yes. And it's charged with contributing to annual reports on how to enhance U.S. Taiwan ties. This is Congress mandating a sustained whole-of-government approach to the relationship.
So it's not just the State Department anymore?
No. It's making sure the Departments of Defense, Commerce, and State are all moving in lockstep, all institutionally elevating Taipei's status without formally breaking those old diplomatic norms with Beijing. It's very clever.
It's clear the U.S. isn't just thinking about diplomatic status, though. They're actively planning for the most volatile, worst-case scenario you can imagine, a conflict over Taiwan. And the Fortifying U.S. Markets from Chinese Military Aggression Act, that bill really puts the potential economic catastrophe into perspective.
It certainly does. This piece of legislation is a massive recognition that having military contingency plans is only half the battle.
Right.
Because if China actually makes a move on Taiwan, the resulting economic shock would be, it would be unprecedented in modern history. This bill is explicitly designed to identify and protect U.S. markets from that fallout.
Let's focus on the scale of that threat for a moment. We're not talking about a recession. We're talking about a global economic contraction that would dwarf previous crises.
Absolutely. The rationale laid out in the bill's text is stark. Initial estimates suggest a Chinese invasion of Taiwan could cause global GDP to fall by $10 trillion.
$10 trillion?
$10 trillion. Just to put that into perspective for you, that's double the contraction we saw during the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic combined.
I can't even process that number.
You're essentially talking about wiping out the entire annual economic output of Germany, the UK, and France all at once.
How quickly would that economic fallout even begin? Is this a slow burn crisis or is it immediate?
It would be immediate and it would be systemic. And the reason for that is almost entirely due to Taiwan's central role in the global technology supply chain.
Semiconductors.
The semiconductors. Taiwan produces nearly 90% of the world's most advanced chips. These are the chips essential for everything from our phones to AI data centers to our most advanced military hardware. If that production stops, the global economy just grinds to a halt, almost overnight.
And for the U.S. specifically?
The estimates are terrifying. Economists project that the U.S. economy alone could face a short-term GDP drop of up to 34%.
A third of the economy.
Gone. All because of this one single point of failure in the supply chain. So this bill, it aims to create an advisory committee of financial experts, think former Fed chairs, former Treasury secretaries, to identify these specific U.S. market vulnerabilities and prepare our capital markets for that extreme volatility.
So it's basically an act of economic self-defense.
That's exactly what it is. It's signaling that the U.S. is treating a Taiwan contingency as a genuine existential threat that requires preemptive legal and financial preparation.
That degree of economic planning, I mean, it proves this is far beyond mere diplomatic signaling. Which brings us to the philosophical shift at the core of all this. We're moving away from what worked, or seemed to work, for decades, strategic ambiguity, toward this big push for strategic clarity. How do we contextualize that fundamental debate?
Well, let's start with strategic ambiguity, or SA, because you're right, for 40 years it was remarkably effective at just maintaining the status quo. It was the policy bedrock. But it wasn't designed as a peace treaty. It was a carefully calibrated deterrence mechanism.
You call it a double-edged sword of deterrence. How exactly did it cut both ways, keeping both Beijing and Taipei in check?
It was, frankly, brilliant in its vagueness. To Beijing, the message was, if you attack Taiwan, the U.S. might intervene militarily. That credible threat forced Beijing to constantly calculate the potentially high cost of an invasion.
And that required the U.S. to maintain
sufficient retaliatory capability in the region. The threat had to be real.
Okay, so that's the edge pointed at Beijing. What about the other edge pointed at Taipei?
That was the disincentive against provocation. Washington made it crystal clear that its security commitment was not a blank check. The U.S. might not intervene if Taiwan engaged in statements or actions that would unilaterally alter Taiwan's status.
Meaning a formal declaration of independence.
Exactly. A formal de jure declaration of independence. So the U.S. could deter China from attacking while also restraining Taiwan from declaring independence, which China says would trigger an invasion.
So the magic was really relying equally on a threat to Beijing and an assurance to Beijing that the U.S. wouldn't support a formal break.
Can you give us a concrete historical example of the U.S. using that disincentive against Taipei?
Oh, yes. The period between 2000 and 2008 is a perfect case study. That's when Chen Shui-bian was president of Taiwan.
Right, and Beijing saw him as pushing for independence.
They did. They perceived his policies as moving toward what they called creeping independence, and that dramatically raised tensions across the strait. The Bush administration at the time had to intervene, and actively.
They publicly and privately distanced themselves from Chen's more provocative moves. It was this incredible tightrope walk. The U.S. had to simultaneously emphasize to Beijing its commitment of no use of force or threat to use force against Taiwan, while also providing Taipei with the weaponry it needed to increase Beijing's expected cost if they did decide to invade.
So the U.S. was basically acting as the brake on Taipei.
Precisely, to prevent Beijing from feeling like it was compelled to use force.
So if that model worked so well for so long, why is it now considered broken? What changed?
The underlying conditions that made it credible, they've fundamentally changed. China has just grown too aggressive and critically too militarily capable.
The power balance has shifted.
Dramatically. China's rapid economic expansion has funded a massive military modernization. They've created a clear military imbalance with their expenditure now 20 times larger than Taiwan's.
20 times.
And the most important military concept here, the one that truly breaks the old SA model, is anti-accessoria denial. A2AD.
Right. What does A2AD really mean on the ground, or I guess on the water?
A2AD capabilities are the specific tools the PLA has developed to counter a U.S. intervention. We're talking about long-range precision missile systems.
The carrier killers.
The so-called carrier killer missiles, yes. But also integrated radar and sensor defenses and large submarine networks. They are all specifically designed to sink U.S. aircraft carriers and support ships, effectively denying our forces the ability to operate within, say, 1,000 miles or more of Taiwan.
So the whole premise of strategic ambiguity
was that the U.S. might intervene. But that relies on the U.S. military being able to effectively project power into the strait. If China can credibly threaten to destroy those assets before they even get close, the U.S. threat is no longer credible.
And strategic ambiguity just becomes ambiguity.
Exactly. The deterrence factor against Beijing is gone.
And this shift isn't just about missiles and ships. It's about a fundamental change in China's behavior and trustworthiness.
Precisely. Advocates for strategic clarity, or SC, they point to this whole pattern of aggressive behavior. You look at the expansion in the South China Sea, the border disputes with India, the construction of military outposts in Bhutan. But most damningly, there's the undeniable violation of the promises made regarding the high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong.
The one country, two systems model.
Which is now completely defunct. When China violates a solemn international promise like that with total impunity, it sets a precedent. And the consensus view among clarity advocates is chillingly pragmatic. If Beijing will crush Hong Kong's freedoms, Taiwan is unquestionably the next target to complete Xi Jinping's vision of national rejuvenation.
So if ambiguity is failing, strategic clarity is the explicit promise that the U.S. would respond to force against Taiwan. But what are the larger stakes here? What happens if the U.S. fails to make that commitment clear?
The stakes are enormous, both for regional stability and for U.S. global influence. If Washington fails to respond to an invasion of democratic Taiwan, it would utterly shatter its standing as the guardian of democracy in Asia.
And our allies in the region.
Our allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, they would be forced to conclude that the U.S. is not a reliable partner. They would inevitably begin to accommodate Beijing's demands.
Leading to a total reordering of the region.
A complete geopolitical reordering where China is the undisputed hegemon. And a forceful takeover would allow China to project its naval power far beyond the first island chain, directly threatening vital U.S. interests, our trade routes, and our access to key global markets.
So, strategic clarity requires more than just a verbal commitment. It requires concrete action.
That's the critical link. The words have to be coupled with tangible steps, strengthening the U.S. retaliatory force in the region, expanding military cooperation with Taipei, providing them with the asymmetrical weaponry they need to defend themselves, and coordinating detailed contingency plans with all of our regional allies. It has to be a unified, visible, and credible commitment.
Now, here's the razor's edge of this whole thing. Even with clarity, you still have to manage Beijing's paranoia. Strategic clarity must explicitly clarify what it is not supporting, right?
This is the most delicate part of the entire policy, and it's what prevents SC from becoming a pure provocation. The policy must explicitly state that its aim is to protect Taiwan's democracy and the well-being of its people, but that it does not support Taiwan's de jure independence.
And why is that disclaimer so important?
Because Chinese leaders have operated under the suspicion for decades that the U.S. has a hidden agenda to undermine their ultimate goal of unification. If Beijing believes that U.S. policy will ultimately lead to Taiwan's permanent formal separation, then they will calculate that they have very little to lose by initiating force now rather than later.
So you have to be firm on the response to force.
But maintain the long-standing U.S. position on independence. It's about countering Beijing's suspicions and avoiding giving them a pretext for military action.
That's a huge shift in posture, mandated by law and backed by this comprehensive economic defense strategy. So we've established the U.S. strategy, maximum clarity. But clarity is only effective if the target is paying attention. What state is Beijing in right now, internally, to handle this kind of assertive legislative pressure?
And this is what's so fascinating. It's the sheer asymmetry of the moment. You have the U.S. Congress functioning at peak legislative output against the CCP, while at the same time Beijing is struggling internally with these deep, self-inflicted wounds that have demonstrably weakened its military apparatus in the short term.
We're talking specifically about the anti-corruption purges that dominated all the headlines in 2023.
Yeah.
What impact did those actually have on their military production?
The impact has been measurable and severe. The purges primarily targeted the very top echelons of the PLA rocket force.
Their missile command.
Their missile command, exactly.
Yeah.
And key figures in military procurement. When senior officials who are responsible for billion-dollar contracts are suddenly arrested or just disappear, the entire supply chain just stalls.
And we're seeing that in the data now.
We are. The data is backing this up. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, they reported in December that the PRC's total military equipment sales declined by 10% in 2024.
And this wasn't part of a global trend.
Not at all. In fact, it's the opposite. This was the largest year-on-year decline they've measured in the last decade, and it happened even as global arms revenue was surging everywhere else. China was the only major exporter whose revenue actually dropped.
Wow. Which specific companies are bearing the brunt of that massive internal disruption?
Two state-owned conglomerates really stand out. First is Norinco, that's the China North Industries Group Corporation, which produces a vast array of ground systems and conventional ordnance. Their revenue fell by 30%.
30%. That's not a dip, that's a collapse.
It's a stunning result of internal politics.
Wow.
And the other is Kisei, the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. They're integral to the PLA rocket force and missile development. Their revenue dropped by 16% compared to 2023.
So what does that kind of decline imply about their actual readiness for a conflict right now?
Well, the clear implication is a severe short-term delay in PLA modernization. When procurement is frozen and your key leadership is purged, production lines slow down, quality control gets questioned, and domestic contracts are either canceled or stalled indefinitely.
And in the context of a potential conflict,
it likely leaves some units ill-equipped or operating below peak readiness. And this creates a really critical window of leverage for Washington. The U.S. is institutionalizing support for Taiwan at the precise moment that Beijing is least prepared internally to respond militarily.
So it maximizes the diplomatic pressure right before that scheduled face-to-face meeting in April.
It's perfect timing, strategically.
And while they're dealing with these internal weaknesses, Beijing is simultaneously trying to manage all these complex external diplomatic relationships.
That's the other half of their balancing act. You know, we saw French Prime Minister Emmanuel Macron visit Beijing earlier this month, and he was there seeking PRC pressure on Russia regarding Ukraine.
And the resulting joint statement called for ceasefires.
It did. It called for ceasefires in Ukraine and the Middle East, aligning, at least on paper, with international law.
But strategically, we all know China is unlikely to sacrifice its relationship with Moscow for European sensibilities.
I think that's the correct analysis. Despite the diplomatic pleasantries and the joint statement, the PRC is considered highly unlikely to actually urge Russia to end the war. Their strategic alignment against Western influence and their need for Russia as a counterweight, it just outweighs the immediate benefit of appeasing European leaders.
And there's also movement on the Korean Peninsula.
Yes, South Korea is resuming efforts for inter-Korean dialogue, which adds yet another layer of complexity to the regional security environment.
And I recall that the U.S. expressed some concerns about Seoul's maneuvering there.
They did. While Seoul was quick to deny that they would suspend combined military exercises to gain favor with the North, the chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul publicly expressed concerns about potential proposals from the Lee administration to reduce those essential military exercises as a way of gaining leverage in the dialogue.
So Beijing is just watching all of this.
Watching all of it, trying to use these diplomatic engagements and regional tensions to their advantage, all while this congressional hammer is coming down hard on the Taiwan issue.
Okay, let's move to that legislative hammer. H.R. 1159 might be the central piece, but Congress passed this massive legislative markup, what you call a veritable firewall of bills, all designed to counter the CCP's malign influence across the globe.
That's right.
This really demonstrates that their strategy isn't just about Taiwan's security, but a unified, deep commitment to containment.
It was a tour de force by Congress. They essentially used this moment to advance an integrated strategy across economic, technological, and human rights domains. These are not disparate bills. They are all elements of a comprehensive legal framework that targets specific vulnerabilities in the CCP's global strategy.
Let's start with how they're trying to strip Beijing of its economic advantages by targeting a massive loophole. H.R. 1107, the PRC is not a developing country act.
This is a direct attack on one of China's most audacious financial manipulations on the world stage. The core policy mandated by this bill is to pursue changing the PRC's status from a developing country to an upper middle income, high income, or developed country within all international organizations, treaties, and agreements.
And for our listeners, why does that designation hold so much financial power for what is now the world's second largest economy?
Because the developing country status is a relic that China flagrantly exploits. This designation allows the PRC to secure near-zero interest loans from international institutions like the World Bank.
So they're getting money that's meant for truly poor countries.
Exactly. Funds that are technically intended for truly struggling nations that are facing poverty and a lack of basic infrastructure. And the cynicism of this arrangement is just profound. The PRC secures this cheap financing and then immediately turns around and uses its own immense financial power to fund its Belt and Road Initiative.
Which is essentially their debt trap diplomacy mechanism.
That's what it is. They lend to smaller, vulnerable nations at high interest rates, and they often secure critical infrastructure or natural resource concessions when those countries inevitably default. So they're using global development funds, subsidized by developed nations, to finance their own coercive geopolitical agenda.
That paints a very clear picture of why Congress is moving to cut off that pipeline.
Yeah.
And related to the BRI, we have H.R. 1157, the Countering PRC Malign Influence Fund. This sounds like the financial muscle to push back against that coercion.
That's right. This bill authorizes $325 million, specifically for the State Department and USI, to proactively counter CCP influence globally. This is not passive defense. This is offensive funding to push back on Beijing's global narrative.
And what are the funds earmarked for?
They're specifically set aside to target activities like promoting corruption, combating economic coercion, and critically exposing the misinformation and the debt trap dynamics related to the Belt and Road Initiative. It's an attempt to arm partner nations with information and alternative financing options so they aren't forced into Beijing's debt cycle.
Shifting focus now to critical infrastructure. Let's talk about the silent war that's happening beneath the waves. H.R. 1189, the Undersea Cable Control Act.
This bill addresses a vulnerability that most people just never even consider: the physical cables that carry nearly all global commerce and communication.
The backbone of the internet.
Literally. The bill requires a defined strategy to eliminate foreign adversaries, and the PRC is the primary focus availability to goods and technologies capable of supporting undersea cables. The goal is to make it impossible for them to build, tap, or interfere with them.
And this is being driven by very real kinetic events that are happening right now, isn't it?
Yes, the constant disruption of cables near Taiwan is a primary driver of this. We can look specifically at the Matsu Island incident, where Chinese maritime militia vessels, often disguised as fishing boats, allegedly severed two undersea cables connecting the island to the main network.
And this wasn't a one-off accident.
Not even close. What makes this so alarming is the pattern. This was cited as the 20th time in 5 years that these specific cables have been disrupted in that immediate area.
20 times in 5 years.
Yeah. That level of frequency moves well beyond accidental damage. It strongly suggests either intentional sabotage or, perhaps more worryingly, a trial run to gauge response times, disrupt communication, and inflict hardship on the island's residents. This bill is about protecting the internet's physical infrastructure itself.
Now we move to the issue of data and influence that hits closest to home for the average person. The legislation people are calling the Spy Balloon in Your Phone Bill, H.R. 1153, the Deterring America's Technological Adversaries Act.
This is perhaps one of the most significant pieces of legislation passed in this whole bundle because it addresses the core legal weakness that previous attempts to restrict apps like TikTok lacked.
What's different this time?
The new law grants the executive branch mandatory constitutional authority to ban or restrict connected software applications if they operate, direct, or otherwise deal with applications that are subject to the influence of China.
Mandatory authority is the key phrase there. It removes the ambiguity of executive discretion. What are the specific malign activities listed that would trigger this mandatory action?
Well, they include the obvious ones: military, intelligence, espionage, or surveillance activities. But crucially, the law specifically mandates sanctions if the application facilitates the control or use of recommendation algorithms that manipulate content.
The algorithm itself is a target.
Yes. U.S. intelligence directors have testified that Beijing uses these algorithms to conduct sophisticated information campaigns aimed at targeting U.S. audiences, particularly young users, to shape political views or influence social narratives. This bill gives the government a legally defensible and robust framework to address that specific threat mechanism.
And TikTok is in the crosshairs.
ByteDance, TikTok, and related entities are explicitly named as targets for a mandatory determination within 90 days of the bill's enactment.
That covers the economic and technological firewalls. Finally, we need to address the human rights and sovereignty condemnations that Congress packaged alongside the Taiwan Act, starting with the deeply disturbing H.R. 1154, the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act.
This bill tackles a horrific industrial-scale criminal enterprise that is run by the Chinese state. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime estimated the illegal trafficking for organ removal is worth between $840 million and $1.7 billion annually.
A billion-dollar industry.
And this bill authorizes imposing sanctions freezing assets, revoking U.S. visas on any individuals who are determined to be funding, sponsoring, or facilitating this practice.
The details surrounding this practice, as cited in the legislative discussions, are almost beyond comprehension in their cruelty.
The evidence points to systematic industrial-scale organ harvesting, primarily targeting political and religious dissidents, Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghurs, Tibetan Buddhists, and other minority groups. The victims are often processed while still alive to ensure organ viability.
It's horrifying.
What is particularly chilling is the cited age profile. Sources indicate that the victims selected for harvesting are often young, with the ideal age cited as being around 28 years old.
Why that age?
This age group is grimly referred to by some in the Chinese medical establishment as the peak of organ ripeness. This bill is Congress's direct condemnation and a legal mechanism to impose some form of accountability for what is essentially state-sanctioned murder.
And lastly, the defense of sovereignty in the skies, which ties all the way back to the incident that first put global surveillance on everyone's radar. H.R. 1151, the Upholding Sovereignty of Airspace Act.
This was the direct bipartisan response to the PRC's Global Surveillance Balloon Program. The bill condemns the PRC for its violation of U.S. airspace, but it also makes clear the global nature of this threat. It notes that the PRC's balloons have violated the sovereignty of over 40 nations across 5 continents.
So this wasn't just an American incident.
Not at all. It was a global violation. And Congress actually used this opportunity to demand more clarity on other airborne phenomena, didn't they?
They did, in a fascinating addition to the bill. It was amended to include a requirement for a classified briefing on unidentified flying objects, UFOs or UAPs, since 2017.
So it effectively links the publicly acknowledged threat of the PRC surveillance balloon with the broader, more secretive issue of unexplained incursions into U.S. airspace that we know have been discussed in classified settings.
And it also circles back to Taiwan.
Yes. The bill advocates for U.S. support for Taiwan's participation in the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. And this is strategically relevant because the PRC frequently violates Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Full ICAO participation would help Taiwan coordinate global air traffic management and security standards, which would further normalize its status internationally.
So when you put it all together, what does this all mean? The U.S. Congress has used its power to mandate clarity toward Taiwan and simultaneously impose these serious new constraints across multiple fronts: economic, military, technological, and human rights on Beijing's ambitions. It feels like a comprehensive, institutionally binding effort that defines the new phase of this great power competition.
It creates a new level of pressure, and I think it shifts the balance of leverage back in Washington's favor. And we return to that opening dilemma. Is this whole package insurance, or is it a bargaining chip?
Right.
The sheer volume, the mandatory nature of it all, and the cross-domain application of this legislation. It argues very strongly for insurance. The passage of H.R. 1159 institutionalizes support for Taiwan. It makes it demonstrably harder for any future administration to simply revert to the decades of shadow rules and diplomatic opacity.
But doesn't mandating a constant review, even if the intent is good, doesn't that create an ongoing source of diplomatic friction? Doesn't it actually make the U.S. look less predictable in Beijing's eyes, even as the law is trying to create clarity?
That is the calculated risk. While the baseline of support is institutionalized, you're right, the law specifically requires that the guidelines be reviewed and updated not less frequently than every 2 years. And this mandatory review means the current administration retains the power of adjustment. They have the legal mechanism to change the relationship again, should Beijing offer a sufficient concession somewhere else.
So it's a lever.
It is a lever. And this mechanism, combined with the timing enacting this elevated status just before these high-stakes talks with the Chinese leadership in April, is highly strategic. It suggests that Taiwan's elevated legal status now has a quantifiable, tangible value on the negotiating table. The U.S. is signaling these are the new rules, legislatively mandated, and any desire you have to ease pressure in other areas will now be measured against the permanence of the support for Taiwan. It is an intentional, aggressive use of domestic law as foreign policy leverage.
The most significant implication of this legislative burst isn't just the increased security for Taiwan, but the fact that the United States is officially, legally, and financially committing to the strategic containment of China at a time when Beijing's own corruption purges have weakened its short-term military readiness, creating a window of maximum leverage for Washington in the coming diplomatic showdown.